The officer pulls you over, walks up to the car with that polite little smile and asks, "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" And you, like an idiot, start explaining your entire life story. You know what you just did? You just handed over, for free, exactly what he wanted. That's not an innocent question. That's a trained trap, used every single day on highways across the United States, and it works because almost nobody knows what to say back. Stick around until the end, because I'm going to show you the exact phrase that protects you, one most drivers have never even heard of. But first, drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. When an officer makes a stop for speeding, he already has everything he needs to write you a ticket: the radar, the clock, the speedometer reading. What he doesn't have yet is a narrative, and that's exactly what he's fishing for when he asks where you were headed. He wants to turn a simple traffic violation into a broader conversation where you, without realizing it, start handing over details about your routine, your commitments, your emotional state, how much of a hurry you're in. All of that can be used later, whether to justify a harsher citation or to open the door to other questions. You seem nervous? Did something happen? Is there anything in the car I should know about? This is the moment when a lot of people make their first mistake without even noticing. They treat the stop like a conversation between two ordinary people, when in reality it's a legal interaction, protected by the U.S. Constitution, especially the Fifth Amendment, which guarantees your right against self-incrimination, and the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. This doesn't mean you should be hostile or suspicious toward the officer. It means understanding that there's a difference between cooperating, which you're required to do, like providing your license, registration, and insurance, and voluntarily narrating your life to someone who is, at the end of the day, trying to build a case against you. In states like California, Texas, or Florida, courts have repeatedly recognized that drivers have the right to stay silent about certain questions, even during a legitimate traffic stop. The difference between reacting on impulse and keeping the conversation within the right boundaries starts exactly here, in that first second after the question is asked. It's the moment when your brain, on autopilot, wants to explain, justify, defend itself. And it's exactly that impulse that often creates more problems than it solves. Here's the pattern I see repeat, year after year, case after case. The officer asks where the person was headed, and they start explaining. "I was running late for work. My wife isn't feeling well. I had an important meeting." It sounds natural. It sounds human. Except every one of those sentences, no matter how harmless it seems, opens a door that was previously closed. Let's think this through practically. If you say you were late for work, the next question might be, what time were you supposed to be there? If the math doesn't line up exactly with the time and distance, now there's a recorded inconsistency. If you say someone is sick, the officer might ask for medical details, or even question why you didn't call 911 instead of driving fast on your own. If you mention a work meeting, he might ask where, with whom, at what time, and every new answer is another thread that can be pulled on later. The problem isn't that you're lying. In most cases, people are telling the truth. The problem is that voluntary information, even truthful information, becomes part of the police report and can be used later, whether to justify a harsher citation or, in more serious cases, as grounds to extend the stop and investigate other things that have nothing to do with the original speeding. There's a simple principle defense attorneys repeat constantly. The more you talk, the more material you hand someone else to work against you. That's not paranoia. That's how the system works in practice every day on highways in Illinois, Ohio, Georgia, no matter the state. And here's another important detail. Trying to convince the officer you had a good reason for speeding rarely works. Speeding is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, a strict liability offense. It doesn't matter why. The ticket exists because the speed was recorded. So when you spend 30 seconds explaining why you were in a hurry, in practice you're not avoiding the ticket. You're just adding unnecessary information to the record of the stop with no real benefit. In the end, the question stops being about proving you had a good reason and becomes about protecting yourself from voluntarily handing over ammunition that could complicate your situation later. So the moment arrives. The officer looks at you and asks, "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" This is the turning point. This is where most people, out of habit, politeness, or simple nervousness, start telling the whole story. And this is exactly where I want to give you a different tool. Instead of making up an excuse, instead of explaining that you were late, instead of narrating your whole day, you can simply respond, calmly and politely, "Officer, I'd prefer not to answer questions about where I was going. I'll provide my license, registration, and insurance." Notice exactly what that sentence does. First, it's respectful. You address the officer as officer. You keep the tone cordial. Second, it fulfills exactly what the law requires of you. providing your license, registration, and proof of insurance, which are legal obligations in virtually every U.S. state. Third, it exercises a clear constitutional right, protected by the Fifth Amendment, without turning it into a confrontation. A lot of people are afraid that refusing to answer will look suspicious, or worse, disrespectful. But there's a huge difference between not cooperating with a stop, which would mean, for example, refusing to hand over documents, refusing to step out of the car when legally asked to, or becoming hostile, and simply choosing not to answer questions that go beyond what's necessary for the traffic violation in question. American courts, including Supreme Court decisions, have made clear that exercising the right to remain silent cannot, by itself, be used as evidence of guilt or as justification for extending a stop. This means you're still cooperating in the sense the law requires, but you stop feeding the conversation with details you have no legal obligation to provide. And here's the most important point. Saying less, in this specific context, is safer than trying to convince the officer there was a good reason for the speed. You're not there to decide whether you deserve the ticket or not. That decision, if contested, happens later, in a courtroom with a lawyer by your side, not on the side of the road, in a 30-second conversation with someone who, in most cases, has already decided he's going to ticket you anyway. Now, here's something a lot of people don't expect. After you give that first, polite, limited answer, the officer, in a good number of cases, won't just accept it and move on. He might keep going with other, seemingly harmless questions. Why were you in such a hurry? Did you know how fast you were going? Is there a specific reason you were driving like that? That sequence of questions is, in practice, a second attempt to get what the first question didn't. And this is exactly where I see the most drivers lose control of the situation. After managing to hold their ground on the first question, a lot of people feel like they need to make up for it by being more open on the second or third question, as if refusing again would make them look even more suspicious. Let's think through the second question. Did you know how fast you were going? If you say yes, you're essentially confirming awareness of the violation, which can show up in the report as an aggravating factor. If you say no, that can also be used in a different way to question your attentiveness while driving. In other words, there's no safe answer to that question. The safest response, in most cases, is simply not to go into that territory at all. The same goes for, is there a reason you were driving like that? That question is, in practice, a second attempt to get the same information as the earlier question about where were you headed. The wording changes, but the goal is the same, to get you talking. The good news is that the same response that worked before can be repeated, with small variations, whenever similar questions come up. I understand, officer, but I'd still prefer not to answer questions beyond what's required. Here's my license, registration, and insurance. You don't need to come up with a new answer for every question. You can, with politeness and consistency, hold the same clear line. What a lot of drivers don't realize is that this pattern of several small questions is a common technique, used precisely because it works on most people, who give in little by little, answering a bit with each question until, in the end, they've said basically everything the officer wanted to know from the start. Let's wrap up with what really matters. How to put all of this into practice, without coming across as hostile, without seeming like you're hiding something, and without turning a routine traffic stop into an unnecessarily tense situation. The first point is understanding exactly where your legal obligation ends. In most U.S. states, you're required to hand over your driver's license, vehicle registration, and proof of insurance when asked. Identify yourself, in some states, if directly asked your name, and stay at the scene until you're released or the stop legally ends. That's it. Beyond that, any question about where you were headed, what you were doing, why you were in a hurry, or details of your personal life falls into a different category, questions you can legally and legitimately choose not to answer. The second point is tone. Everything we've talked about here only works if it's said calmly, politely, and consistently. Phrases like, "I'd prefer not to answer that, officer," or "I'm going to keep this simple and just provide my documents," sound completely different when said with hostility versus when said in a calm, respectful tone. The goal is never to irritate the officer or make it look like you're hiding a crime. The goal is simply to not voluntarily provide information the law doesn't require. The third point, and maybe the most important one, keep your hands visible, follow safety instructions like rolling down your window or keeping your hands on the wheel, and never confuse exercising your right to stay silent on certain questions with refusing to physically cooperate with the stop. Those are completely different things, and mixing them up is what can actually turn a simple stop into something much more serious. At the end of the day, you don't have to choose between being polite and protecting your rights. You can do both at the same time. A traffic stop is not the place to prove your innocence or build your defense. That happens later, with time, calmly, and with proper legal help if needed. On the side of the road, your only job is to get out of there safely, having provided exactly what the law requires. No more, no less. And if this video helped you understand your rights better, drop a like, because it helps a lot more people find this content. And if you want to keep learning how to protect yourself during stops, tickets, and everyday situations with police in the United States, subscribe to the channel now, because every week there's a new video like this, straight to the point, no legal jargon. See you in the next video.